Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Good afternoon, and welcome to WCAT Radio and this edition of Inter Vitam et Mortem, Between Life and Death, interviews and discussion with a Catholic bioethicist. I am your host, Dr. Anne Urlakis. I'm a classically trained and degreed bioethicist, and today I have with me a terrific guest, Father Deacon Tom Davis. Before we begin, let us start as we always do with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Dear
Amen.
God, our heavenly Creator, you are the author of life and of truth, the reality that you will each and every human person into being, created from the moment of conception, bearing the dignity and imprint of your own image and likeness within the very essence of our being, is a mystery beyond human understanding. Please help us to have a greater appreciation for the gift of being created in your image and likeness. Help us to reverence that reality in our brothers and sisters, especially in the tiniest and most vulnerable among them. Help us to defend the sanctity of every human life from conception to natural death. We ask this through the intercession of Our Lady, the Blessed Virgin Mary, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you again for tuning in to this episode of WCAT Radio's Inter Vitam et Mortem, Between Life and Death. Today I have the opportunity to introduce listeners of Inter Vitam et Mortem to a dynamic guest, Father Deacon Tom Davis, who is the president and founding director of the Liberty Institute for Faith and Ethics. He is also the Assistant Attorney General of the great state of Connecticut. And if that's not enough, he is also the faculty chair and adjunct professor of bioethics and law at Holy Apostles College and Seminary, and an ordained deacon for the eparchy of Newton, presently serving at St. Anne Melkite Catholic Church in Danbury, Connecticut. Welcome, Father Deacon Tom. I'm delighted that you're able to accept my invitation to be a guest. Thank you for joining us.
I'm delighted to be with you. Thank you so much, Mary. And, I love that prayer you opened with. That was beautiful. You focused on the key issue in bioethics, the Creator. So we'll have a lot to talk about
that. Thank you. Please continue.
Well, a lot of the debates we face in the bioethics today are about autonomy, about who decides. And, of course, all of us who are followers of the Master, who believe and worship Jesus Christ, and who know and love the Trinity and hope to be with the Trinity eternally, recognize that we're contingent, I guess the philosophical term is unnecessary beings, but we are. We exist. We exist because of love. And that means that there's a Creator. And he has certain prerogatives. So that leads into a whole world of natural law theory, which is so much of what our concerns about bioethics are based on. Natural law, something that presumes certain givens. We have a nature. We can identify our nature. We can recognize our purpose and our end by our reason, and so forth. And that presumes a Creator. Your prayer opened up with this praise of the Creator, and I think that understanding and speaking about God as Creator is a very helpful way to discuss with believers bioethical questions. Of course, when we talk with the secular society and those who are not believers, we need to go to that natural law theory, to that use of reason to explain what we believe.
Thank you. Thank you for explaining that position as well. And I agree with you. I think so many of the ethical issues that we are confronted with we forget that we are made in that image and likeness of God. And this show over the past year, we've gone into the difference between a secular bioethical viewpoint and a viewpoint from a Catholic bioethicist. And my entire perspective is always grounded in that Imago Dei, the image of God that we are created in. You've got a phenomenal website. Before we get to your phenomenal website and the project, I want you to tell the listeners a little bit about who you are and what drives you to do what you do.
Well, I guess, thank you. Well, I am a deacon in the Melkite Greek Catholic Church, one of the Byzantine Rite churches privileged to enjoy full communion with the Church of Rome and the Holy Father. And I have been ministering as a deacon for 15 years. Before that, I was involved with the late, great Monsignor David Q. Liptak here in Connecticut, who for 40-odd years was the editor of the Archdiocese of Hartford newspaper, the Catholic Transcript, a very well-known paper in Catholic circles. And Monsignor Liptak introduced me to the study of bioethics, and we became very close friends. And we worked very hard in trying to further develop what was then called the Pope John Paul II Bioethics Center. He had founded that with Father Francis Lesko, who was at that time, in the early 1980s, 1980-81, was the president of the American Philosophical Association, and with a doctor, a physician, Leo Duffy. And they did this in response to the great John Paul II, let's just call him John Paul the Great, I think that's the better term, John Paul the Great's first encyclical, Redemptor Hominis, which had a section in it, a paragraph, but just a couple sentences actually, about the need for a greater development of ethics and morals to match the rapid greater development of science and biotechnology and technology. So that gave the impetus to the founding of the Pope John Paul II Bioethics Center. I came along about 10 years after that and met Father Liptak. The other founders had passed on, and he and I then worked to keep the Pope John Paul II Center alive. So that's how I got into that world. And we're going to talk a lot about that. We have a lot of information to share with your listeners. I'm an assistant attorney general in the state of Connecticut, and I'm a dad, very proud dad. Boy, am I proud of I have a daughter who's just graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy, and she's now an officer on a guided missile destroyer. So when she comes home to visit, I don't make her clean her room because I'm sort of afraid of her now.
There are not too many, people that can claim to have a daughter who is a officer in charge of missile launch on a guided. That is a heck of a claim to fame.
It's a reason to have an escape hatch out the back of your house in case she gets upset with me. So. And I'm married to a wonderful woman. My wife's a member of the Eastern Orthodox churches, and we live sort of the hopeful reunion of the Eastern Orthodox and Catholic churches, something we live, I think, quite intensely within our own family.
That is awesome.
That's, and she's just a fantastic, she's actually my webmaster for the Liberty Institute for Faith and Ethics because she knows how to do everything with computers and websites, and I know how to plug them in. That's about it.
Well, she's
done
an incredible job with this site. There is so much on there, and I'm going to want to make sure that for the written portion, the summary statement that goes along on the WCAT website and the speaker website for this, that we have the link provided for your website. There is just so much there in terms of content, the bioethics content, the legal content, the course that you teach, that you offer on there that I'm going to be doing. There's just so much. I wish this portal, you combine so many resources that are necessary. I often say that because this program is a branch of Holy Apostles College and Seminary, and the seminarians are near and dear to my heart. That I'm always looking for, what are we doing for them? Well, this resource for anyone who is scholarly minded, for anyone who's looking at the subject of bioethics or the nexus of bioethics and law in a scholarly way, this website pulls together just a ton of resources that will save you time trying to hunt down these things on your own. It's great.
Well, thank you. We put a lot of effort to get it right. The Liberty Institute for Faith and Ethics, which, when you just use the initials, it spells out life. So we talk about it in shorthand as life. Life has life's a resource center. It's got a library of extensive collection of documents, magisterial documents, church documents, but also other sources besides church documents. I don't put up material that is offensive, of course. I don't put up things that support material or points of view that contradict church teaching, but there are so many sources of superb scientific research out there. We try to put a lot of that up there, too, when it's relevant to the issues we're talking about. For instance, I think this is probably one of the big topics of the last 10 years, emergency contraception in sexual assault cases. That's a very, very important, delicate topic, and we have a tremendous amount of resources on that that we think are among the best you can get in the English-speaking world, and they're on there. We also we're a think tank. We're a research institute. We're a cultural commentator as well. So we've broken it into several components. There is the St. John Paul II Bioethics Center, and that's what I spoke about before, that was founded by Fathers Lesko and Liptak and Dr. Duffy. That contains in it the rather extensive bioethics library you referred to. We also have something that we think is absolutely unique in this field, and that is the annual lecture series that we have. The lecture series was started by Monsignor Liptak and Father Lesko back in the 80s, and they had just a tremendous group of speakers come in early on, and I think that if people can go on, they can read about the lecture series, how it was founded. But in the early years, Ronald Lawler, great Capuchin Franciscan, in 1981, about what's bioethics? What is it? What's it happening in it? Where is it going? It was followed up by the great late William May from Catholic View on reflections on laboratory production of human life. Ralph McInerney from out at Notre Dame, great philosopher. Raymond Dennehy, another great philosopher from out in San Francisco. And even Germain Grisey was legendary for his work in moral theology. So some very big names, some very excellent work. And then it went into a hiatus because the founders, except for Monsignor Liptak, died. And Monsignor Liptak was running full-time parishes, editor of the Catholic Transcript, and so it stalled for a while. But in 1992, he and I started resurrecting the center itself and its resources, and then a few years later, we actually started the lecture series again. And that began with Cardinal Lorenzi coming out to Holy Apostles, delivering a rather eloquent address, which is really a survey of the major bioethic issues that touch on magisterial teaching. And then we went into, because we're interdisciplinary, and we don't want to just talk about church teachings and dogma and doctrine, we want to talk about law, we want to talk about anthropology, we want to talk about science, we want to talk about chemistry, if they're relevant to our topics.
Sure.
We had John Haas, who is the president of the National Catholic Bioethics Center, great guy. And John came up and gave us a talk on the neurological criteria for determining death. So what is typically referred to as brain death. A few years later, we had Father Nicanor Astraiko from Providence College, who was a PhD biologist and a fantastic theologian, very faithful to the church, solid as a rock. He came up and he took a slightly different point of view, suggesting that maybe there's other issues to study about bodily integration and whether you can determine someone's actually dead. So that's a very interesting debate. At a very high scholarly level and on the website, we had the great pleasure of hosting Paul Chak, who was then the director of Courage International, a ministry to same-sex attracted persons, particularly Catholics. Paul Chak is a wonderful priest in the Diocese of Bridgeport, now is the rector of their pre-seminary formation program. And he came on and spoke about the Courage Apostolate and this issue. Like I said, we try to reach into other fields. So Alan Sears, who is the founder of the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is really the preeminent law firm in the world defending life, marriage, and the traditional values that we find ourselves supporting.
Yes.
And they've been, for instance, they just won a huge Supreme Court decision called Masterpiece Cake about Jack Phillips in Colorado, who declined to bake a cake for a same-sex marriage celebration because he felt that his artistic talents would be making a statement endorsing that point of view. And the Supreme Court found that the Colorado commissions discriminated against him because of his religious position, and they found they violated equal protection of laws, and they threw out the penalties and so forth. So he won that case. So we have a lot of those speakers. You know, just recently, the great Jesuit of one of the great Jesuits, they're having so many, of the 20th century, James Schall, passed away. He was a political philosopher at Georgetown of great renown, tremendously powerful intellect. And I had the honor of spending a weekend with him just this past fall, just before he died a few months later, and he delivered the 2018 bioethics lecture, which is political philosophy and bioethics, and it's a tour de force about natural law and what we mentioned earlier, the givens that form our view of human nature, and how what he calls the modern project has attempted to liberate human nature from the givens of a creator, and therefore the tensions that come between secular bioethics and Christian bioethics. So that's one of the big parts of our website.
I am so impressed by the breadth and the depth of this website. I am just astounded. I search these sites frequently, and to have stumbled on this one, you have so much there. It is all timely. It is all very scholarly. You look at the names that you have represented here. They are all heavyweights in their own right. One of the things that you've touched on here that I find, I mentioned breadth, just the amount of resources that you have that cover such a wide variety of these topics in both law and bioethics, all coming down to life as the centerpiece of the discussion. But it is not a one topic, one area. We're not talking about only end-of-life issues, although you do a great job on end-of-life issues. You're not talking only nascent human life or assisted reproductive issues or death penalty or brain death. There are so many, and yet there is the link that holds it all together, and that it is authentically Catholic. It is magisterium faithful. So for all the seminarians who are out there, for the formators who are out there, the bishops, the rectors of seminaries who are listening to this program, this is a great resource to get up and get on, to have links to from your own institutions. It will certainly help those who are in formation with the papers they're writing and the research they're doing, and the homilies that they're preparing, and their ability to counsel those who come to them with these deep questions. And those questions usually arrive at our doorsteps when we are least equipped to deal with them, when we don't have these things at our fingertips. This is a terrific resource.
Well, thank you so much for that. I mean, I'm if you could see me, I'm blushing. It's great to hear it, because that's what we're trying to do, and you never really know till you get feedback if people are getting what you're attempting to do. So thank you so much. We cover a lot of topics, as you said, and we have the end-of-life issues. We have particularly, I think, quite important, we have a series of forms for advanced medical directives and appointments of healthcare representatives, which I think are extremely important. They're very nuanced. They capture Catholic teaching excellently. And I think, personally, they're the best there are out there. But the topics go much farther than that. You mentioned death penalty, and we talked about determination of death, but there's all the questions of end-of-life medical moral decision-making, which is much more complex than just dying. There's the question of euthanasia and suicide, physician-assisted suicide. There's all the issues in palliative care and hospice. A couple of years ago, I had the tremendous honor of working with Archbishop Henry Mansell of Hartford. What a fantastic man. And Archbishop Mansell agreed to hold a white mass that the Catholic Medical Association Guild in Hartford, that he allowed to be established, hosted. And I had helped form that organization. I'm a lawyer, and so I was able to do their corporate paperwork. And we had a speaker come up from Calvary Hospital in the Bronx. So Calvary Hospital is a hospital that provides palliative care. People who are admitted to Calvary are dying. And they are an amazing group of people. Michael Brescia was the physician who came up. Michael Brescia is well known in the medical world. There's something called the Semino-Brescia, or sometimes called the Brescia-Semino fistula, and it's the manner by which most hemodialysis is performed. Prior to that, dialysis was an incredibly complex, bloody, and dangerous procedure, but he had the insight about how to change that and create this breakthrough, which has to rank with interior body imaging and antibiotics as some of the major developments of the 20th century in medicine. And he came up and gave us a talk about what it is to stand outside the room of a dying person and to realize that you are the physical manifestation of Jesus Christ to that person when you walk in that room. You're the covenant healthcare giver. And the talk he gave was about the dangers of physician-assisted suicide and how deeply it undermines the confidence of the person you're caring for, and how you tell them on one hand, I will never abandon you. That's the covenant that a healthcare provider makes with the patient. It's the covenant of a husband and a wife, of a parent and a child. Will never abandon. And then on the other hand, tell the person, by the way, you can just check out. So it shrouds that relationship with falsity. And it undermines not just the patient's confidence, it undermines the caregiver's relationship and their own understanding of themselves. So I was so moved by hearing Dr. Brescia. So I'm currently trying to get the audio recording of that talk so I can post it up on the Life website. It's quite remarkable. But that's just one of the kind of topics we do. But we get into everything. The biotechnology, the development of CRISPR, genetics, regenerative medicine, stem cell research, pluripotency. It runs the gamut. There's a lot there. And we also have, I think, very helpful, I wanted to point out to especially the seminarians and to their formators and to the bishops. If there are any bishops listening, I hope you didn't turn off the radio yet. There is a Pius XII reader that we've put on to our library. Eugenio Pacelli is a giant. He is one of the great men of history, Pope Pius XII. And, in fact, one of our lecture series was by Gary Krupp, a Jewish businessman from Long Island who has founded Pave the Way Foundation, in large part to support a historical understanding of the greatness of Pius XII. He had grown up thinking Pius XII was a monster. That's what he was taught. But when he began to understand what happened as he was assisting, he supplies a lot of medical devices to hospitals around the world, and he was asked to help out with a hospital in Rome. He got to know a lot of the Catholic leaders in the hospital in Rome, and he began to study Pius XII. And he's launched a massive international study of all of Pius XII's career and has become one of his champions. In that Pius XII reader, we have allocutions and speeches by Pius the 12th, which form the foundation for modern Catholic bioethics. He's really the foundation of it all.
He is. He is.
So I really would encourage any seminarian to be sure you're familiar with the reasoning and elocutions of Pius XII. They are absolutely pristinely clear, and they're developed at great length in the years that followed, especially by John Paul the Great, by then Cardinal Ratzinger with the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and other leaders of that congregation. And our topics go on to other issues like religious liberty and sexuality and sexual ethics, gender identity, same-sex attraction. You know, a lot of times people from our perspective can be accused of not appreciating other people's affective attractions. When a person who tells me they're same-sex attracted tells me they're in love with their same-sex attracted person, their partner, I believe them. Of course they're in love. Love is normal. Love is good. Of course, there's a lot of problems there, and we see there's some deformities. But we want to not attack these people and criticize them for actually believing they have an affective attraction. They do have an affective attraction. They love the person. And it is normal in sexual intimacy that people who engage in it bond. That doesn't happen, I guess, with people who do it as a career, professional sex workers and so forth. But a husband and a wife deepen their bond through their intimacy. That happens at an emotional level. And we have to recognize it's happening with people in same-sex relationships as well, which makes it all the more difficult to reach them. And so the ministry is quite important. We have a lot of resources about that I think are superb. There's a developing topic that's frightening called transhumanism. I don't have a lot on there yet about it because I want to be careful what I put up. But transhumanism is a movement to transform evolution of the human species by technology, by chemicals, by surgery. The technological ability of human beings will advance. It will advance dramatically and exponentially in the years ahead. And perhaps there will be things that are just unimaginable to us that will be done. But it goes back to foundations. So we have a lot on there on foundations too, natural law theory and so forth. There was talk when I first got in.
Back at that Imago Dei again, being made in the image and likeness of God. Transhumanism attacks that image in a very fundamental way. Who is it that we really are? What is, when we look at the anthropology of the human person and the hubris of pretending that we can do better than God did.
Right.
There's a lot there.
Well, let me try a little shameless self-promotion. on one of the resources on the Library of Advanced Medical Directives and in that category of things, there's a master's thesis I did on advanced directives in which I explore the anthropology of human nature and how it was used in legal circles to advance certain agendas. Typically, you hear this referred to as the development of the Supreme Court case law on the right of privacy. It's actually a deep philosophical discussion. These justices are not writing pop psychology. Well, sometimes Justice Scalia would accuse some of the others of doing that, but they were diving deep into fundamental questions of anthropology and meaning and what is a human being. And they came to quite diverse opinions. So that's a little plug for my thesis.
Well,
but our center's not limited to resources. We also have, for instance, in the Bioethics Center, we have a journal that we've begun. We just have published the first issue in 2018. We expect to have another one in 2019 at the St. John Paul II Journal of Bioethics. And it focuses on bioethical inquiry that is drawn from insights found in the writings and other materials of John Paul the Great. In addition to that, we're beginning to develop something I'm really excited about. It's called the Cultural Expression Project. Now, it's really in its infancy.
Please explain that.
Well, the life issues, the family issues, the issues about the sexual revolution and its impact on society, and we can't dodge that. If you read Benedict XVI's recent article about what the sexual revolution did in contributing to the priestly abuse crisis, we know we have to talk about this. And that means we have to be able to talk about the beauty of human sexuality and stop being stuck in talking about, quote-unquote, the marital act and refer to it in a way that the modern mind wants to hear. We talk about sexual intimacy, sexual intercourse between spouses. And what this means, that's driven by culture. Same thing with transhumanism. It's driven by cultural developments. Same thing by law. When it decides to recognize the right to abortion or a right to physician-assisted suicide in Washington State or Vermont or just recently in New Jersey, that's driven by cultural developments. So we thought it was critical to get involved in a cultural expression project. We've just begun to post some literature. Now, we have to use material that doesn't violate copyright, so there's some limits on what we can put. But right now, we've put up some very famous, I think really wonderful bioethical classics. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It's one of the great bioethical works of all time. Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote a short story called The Birthmark, which is a fantastic story about a man who tells his wife one day, after 25 years of happy marriage, that he thinks he should have the spot on her face removed. And she tells him she thinks it's actually a beauty mark. And he tells her, well, perhaps on some other woman. And, of course, the woman's shocked to hear that. He says, seeing it on you, it reminds me of the imperfection of humans. He then begins to treat her to remove the spot, and as the spot fades, she loses vitality, and as the spot eventually disappears, she dies. Very much the same theme as you encounter in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. There are some things that we're able to do that we shouldn't do. So we're going to build up the cultural expression material quite a bit. We can go back to Sophocles' Antigone. That's on the site. Antigone.
One of my favorites.
Right. She buried her brother. Right? And when the king said, whoever tries to bury him, the brother had rebelled against the king, was killed in a civil war. The king's decree was the body remains in the fields for the animals to devour and rot. No one may bury him. And among the Greeks, burial of a warrior is considered a great honor and something you would always do. The sister could not tolerate that, and she buried the body. It was dug up by other sentries who found it buried and pulled it out and told the king. And the king said, well, keep watch, and whoever does it, capture them and bring them to me, because whoever does that will die by being walled up in a cave. And they capture Antigone burying her brother again, and the king says to her, did you not know? And her response is, all knew, but there's a law above the king.
Exactly.
So this is
that is
natural
the
law.
first time natural law is, and it is put in the mouth of a woman, which is really radical for the ancient Greeks. But she says to Creon that there is a law that is above your law. It is written on the human heart. She makes the connection between the heart as being and written. We talk about the word and how important logos is and what it means to have logos inscribed upon our heart. Here we have Antigone speaking of the law that is higher, very similar to what you'll see in Plato's Phaedo, with law having a capital L. This is a personified law that is greater than anything that her uncle Creon could ever create. Now, Antigone is also engaged to his son, and it is incredible because you have the familial bonds there. You have law. You have higher law. Is there such thing as a higher law? Well, clearly we thought so then. And there are some truths. We look at our transcendentals, goodness, truth, beauty, unity, and they were recognized then. That's what I love about your Cultural Expressions project, is that...
Let me suggest to formators and seminarians that they consider grabbing one or two of these plays. This is a great one. The other one is Murder in the Cathedral by T.S. Eliot. And invite some people to come in, host a dinner, give people roles, read the plays together in a play read, and then have a dinner afterwards with some kind of a meal that matches the themes of the story. We do that sometimes. We host what we call a play read with a meal, and it's a great opportunity to take a piece of culture and dig deep into it and have a wonderful dinner conversation afterwards, which is where you reach people a lot more than... Well,
preaching.
You can reach them many ways. It's one way to reach people. And it's a lot of fun,
and one of the things I love about your Cultural Expressions project and what you're suggesting is this is so very much in tune with who Pope John Paul was as Cardinal Wojtyla, as a seminarian, and before seminary. It was that cultural. It was, the jeweler's shop. It was telling the truths of marriage via the literary format. And reaching hearts and minds that way. So it is so consistent with everything else you have up on that website. Really, quite a masterpiece there.
Well, the Antigone is a masterpiece. The website is a work in progress. So we have other things in addition to the Bioethics Center. So we have the St. John Paul II Bioethics Center. We also have the Center for the Study of Bioethics and Law. That is a program that's going to provide free online courses. Right now, the course we have up is Bioethics and Law 101. And I want to say, if you really want to understand what's going on in the issues of bioethics and law, you really you need more than the church's documents. You need to understand law. If you don't understand law, you're not going to be in the debate for long. The questions that will come up is, do you know what separation of powers are? Do you understand what the enumerated powers are? How about the rational relationship test? How about the necessary and proper clause of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and strict scrutiny and suspect classifications? All those concepts need to be understood to be able to intelligently engage the debate about things like Roe versus Wade, Doe versus Bolton, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, so many of these cases that have rocked our society. And it's not material that's readily available. You can go on something like Wikipedia and read about this, but you will get a certain kind of presentation. Bioethics and Law 101 is a free course. It's 11 lessons. It's really at a graduate level study program. It's a lot of reading. You get a lot of reading. And there's also lecture notes. So it's at your own pace. You do it at your own speed. And I think it's a very helpful thing. People who have read it and have studied through it have told me that they have a new appreciation of the topics they're engaged in debating. And it makes you a much more effective witness, by the way, if you happen to testify before legislative committees. So I would encourage that. So we're really proud of that. We'll have more courses coming up soon on that. We also have the Religious Liberty Observatory. So the Religious Liberty Observatory is really a collection of resources on law. Right now, we're focusing on the clauses of the First Amendment, the religion clauses of the First Amendment. That's the right to religious liberty, free exercise, and the clause that the government will not establish religion. And there are some statutory developments that are huge, just absolutely huge in American law. And what that's known as is RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, that was adopted by the United States Congress in the early 1990s in response to a Supreme Court case that changed how infringements of religious liberty were tested by the Supreme Court. A famous case called Employment Division of Oregon v. Smith. So a lot of resources in law that go into those cases, that go into what those clauses mean, what those statutes are. We're going to soon be posting, I've just about got it done, but it's finding time to squeeze it all in, a compilation of every Supreme Court decision on religious liberty and establishment clause since the late 1800s, all the way up to, well, right now I'm up to about 2018. We're going to have some decisions coming down this year we expect to be adding about all the various tests and elements that go into assessing exactly what is religious liberty. How far does it go? When can government limit it?
Again, when we talk about formators, seminarians, bishops, folks in formation, this is another resource for all of us, but for them in particular, too. I'm thinking of the Fortnight for Freedom coming up. This is an area that we need to be well-versed in, and it is
I'll give you a great example. You mentioned the Fortnight for Freedom. Now, Archbishop Laurie in Baltimore really was the originator of that. He was the Bishop of Bridgeport, Connecticut. I live within the boundaries of the Diocese of Bridgeport. I'm not a member of that diocese. I'm an Eastern Rite, as you mentioned earlier, of the Eparchy of Newton. So I know many of the priests and people in the Diocese of Bridgeport. Bishop Laurie faced a horrific situation. It's 10, 12 years ago. I can't remember exactly the year now. About 10 years ago. The state of Connecticut Judiciary Committee proposed a bill that would prohibit a priest or a bishop from being a voting member of a parish corporation, so that only lay people could run the corporations of the parishes. Well, this would drastically undermine Catholic doctrine.
Sure.
If you took over right now, the law in Connecticut and in many states have special statutes for different religions. And Connecticut has a Catholic statute. They have an Episcopal statute, a Baptist one. They have them for many different groups, Methodists and so forth, so that you can form your corporate entities consistent with your own religious institution's rules. Therefore, in Connecticut, a bishop is always on the parish corporation. So is the pastor. And so is the vicar general of the diocese. So that's 3.
Same as it is here in Wisconsin too. And then you're
then there's 2 lay persons from the parish.
Right.
Now that's very important. And no major property, real estate, can be transferred without the approval of the bishop. Well, that's absolutely essential to maintain the integrity of Catholic doctrine and the hierarchical structure of the Church. And attacking that directly attacked the spiritual paternity of the bishop, not just of his priests, but of all his faithful. So there was a massive legislative hearing, and thousands of Catholics showed up in a huge protest at the Capitol. And of course, the bill was pulled. It was a great moment for Catholics in Connecticut, or so people thought. In my opinion, it wasn't such a great moment. It was great that so many people rallied, but the idea that the bill could even be proposed tells you that we're not in a safe position, and religious liberty is facing great challenges. That's just a really well-known example of what happened back in those days. And what was behind that?
For to have gotten that
far,
the group called, to have gotten that far is just incredible.
Well, the people behind that were Voice of the Faithful in Connecticut. And Voice of the Faithful was dead set on eliminating clerical control of the Church. Anyway, that was a historical development. I think it's a great example of the kind of thing why it's necessary to know what religious liberty is about and how it is interpreted by the Supreme Court. And that's what the Religious Liberty Observatory currently addresses. And that's going to expand quite a bit. It also points out, I'd like to give a plug to some of the great organizations out there that Catholics and formators and bishops can have great confidence in working with. Of course, there's the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty. And Mark Renzi, professor at Catholic U, they do a tremendous amount of fantastic religious liberty litigation. So the Becket Fund, fantastic group. The American Center for Law and Justice is Jay Sekulo's group down in Virginia, very good. An amazing organization, and an organization I'm an allied attorney with, is Alliance Defending Freedom out in Scottsdale, Arizona. and in other places. I mentioned them earlier. They won the Masterpiece Cake case. They are amazing group of people. And there's a few others. There's the First Liberty Institute and the Thomas More Society. These are law firms that are involved in tremendous efforts fighting the battle in the trenches, in the courthouses, in the district courts, challenging statutes that are limiting religious liberty, challenging administrative regulations, challenging government actions, sometimes at the local level in zoning laws and so forth, that are, if not always intentionally attacking religious liberty. I don't want to put that kind of malice in every time we see a restriction, but
sure.
Sometimes there is that malice, like that bill I mentioned in Connecticut. Other times, it's infringements that simply don't recognize religious liberty as something special. And I hear this from other lawyers. Well, why is religious liberty special? That's a very common thing you'll hear from lawyers. Why does religious liberty get special status in the Constitution? And, you only have to look over the history of persecution in the world, then and now. Take a look at Iraq, what's happened to the Yazidis, and what's happened to the Christians in the Nineveh Plain. We'll be posting some things this week on one of our blogs about something called the Potomac Declaration, which was issued during a meeting called last July by Secretary of State Pompeo and the U.S. Ambassador at Large on Religious Freedom and Persecution, Sam Brownback. And they pulled together 80 participants, government and non-government organizations, and issued the Potomac Declaration, which is a fantastic declaration about religious liberty. They released an action plan of how governments can move forward on religious liberty and pluralism and peaceful coexistence, especially by repealing, in other parts of the world, we don't have it here, but anti-blasphemy laws, which are really horrific. We just saw this woman who was imprisoned in Pakistan for a decade on completely trumped-up charges, and they wanted to kill her.
Right.
She's now in Canada, Asibisi. Fortunately, she got out. But that's based on anti-blasphemy laws. They're a terrible thing, and the Potomac Declaration takes them on squarely, which is a tremendous development from really a great Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and Vice President Pence is very much behind that effort as well. And as a result of it, they've initiated a program where instead of just relying on the United Nations funding redevelopment in a place like Iraq that was so savaged by ISIS, they're directing money to groups that were minorities that were affected particularly disproportionately, like the Christians and Yazidis in the Nineveh Plain in northern Iraq. That's very important because there's lots of money allocated, but it doesn't matter how money is allocated. It matters how the money is spent. And are they getting their homes and their schools and their hospitals rebuilt? Or is it being siphoned off in corruption or for pet projects for somebody's brother-in-law who wants to build a bridge and make a nice profit? So this is a fantastic development. We'll be seeing a lot about that in the next week on Life.
This is a very important area. There have been great inroads made recently regarding religious liberty, but in the not-too-distant past, in this country, we can see that liberty, religious liberty has been put in a box, that it has been shuffled. The terminology of religious freedom of worship versus religious liberty has slowly encroached in some of the legislation.
It has, and it's encroached even more dramatically. Again, culture drives what happens. The first part of the word culture is cult. And religion is about cult, in the good sense of the word.
In the good sense.
Right. So it's come even more profoundly, this distinction between liberty, religious liberty versus religious worship, as though worship is the extent of liberty. We found this widely in the talk of one of the candidates in the last presidential election, and we see it increasingly in political discourse and in cultural discourse. A lot of talk about you have freedom of worship. What's your problem? Well, when I was raised, my mama taught me that religious conduct included things like visiting the sick, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, the works of charity, the corporal works of mercy, the things that put you in the public square doing things, not just in church in worship. So we have to be careful that the cultural shift doesn't work its way into law. That's a great deal of what the Liberty Institute for Faith and Ethics and the Religious Observatory portion is all about. That's a big point. I'm glad you brought that up. It's really quite critical. And people don't recognize it because, let's face it, in the United States, we have tremendous liberty. We really do have tremendous liberty.
We do.
But it is being chipped away. And I just, without getting too much into the weeds, normally, if something happens in law that infringes on your religious liberty, the government has to show that it has a very compelling reason for doing it, and they can't do it by any other means that's less offensive to your liberty. If something that hugely important happens, then we recognize that they may have to infringe on liberty sometimes. They can have a rule that says if you have an old church that's 300 years old and the wood is all dried out and it's a tinderbox, if you're going to have open flame inside that building, there have to be very careful rules about that. That makes sense, doesn't it? There's a compelling reason for that. You got to be careful not to burn the building down and somebody get killed. But when Stephen Breyer, a justice on the Supreme Court of the United States, was at his confirmation hearing during the presidency of William Jefferson Clinton, he was asked about religious liberty and religious worship and how his views were on it and what his views were on it, and about government action that can help religion. Would that be offensive, in his view, of the First Amendment Establishment Clause? And he said, no. There's a great history, a great tradition in our country, in our history, of accommodating religion and of welcoming religion. He seemed to be very generous in his comments. He was asked for an example, and the example he gave was that if a church is on fire, the fire department can put the fire out. Oh, gee, thanks a lot. I mean, it would be discriminatory if you wouldn't put the fire out. Of course you have to put it. That's not recognizing religious liberty. That's just being a human being. So there's danger, and it seeps in, even without, and I don't suggest that Justice Breyer has malice towards religion, not at all. It's just the way a lot of people think about religious liberty. So today, the rule of law is, if government infringes on religious liberty indirectly, without intending it, by adopting rules that are uniform for society, then that's okay, generally. And it doesn't really violate the First Amendment. That normally in the past it would have, prior to 1990, in many cases. And so that's why Congress adopted a law, and 21 or 22 states have now adopted laws that still impose that compelling need, least restrictive means test. And that's how we won the great victory in the Hobby Lobby case that Justice Alito wrote the decision on. That was a case that an employer didn't want to fund an insurance plan that was required by Obamacare to cover certain kinds of contraception that they viewed as abortifacients, particularly emergency contraceptives. And the court ruled, well, you know what? That does infringe the religious liberty under these statutory rules that Congress adopted after Smith versus Oregon. But they didn't rule that it would violate the First Amendment. So right now, a lot of our religious liberty teeters on legislation, which can be changed by majority control of Congress. Yeah. So we need to see some re-strengthening, re-entrenchment from the Supreme Court of the United States on religious liberty, and we're certainly hoping to see that in the next couple of years. There's a number of cases.
What you've developed is a tremendous resource in so many ways. The religious liberty issue. I love the cultural expression issue. I can see some of my friends in liberal arts positions at some of the universities around here who will love that page and the resources that are there. Your bioethics issues. As we've said before, many of these are issues that are not being taught in a structured way, and you make it so easy for heads of departments, for professors, for students to go to one comprehensive place and find these resources. I am really thrilled as both a independent bioethicist, as an educator, to be able to have these resources, and grateful.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. I hope that people will go to our website. It's easy. It's Liberty for Life, Liberty, the number 4, life.org. And, on the homepage, you'll see the Facebook icon up in the left. Give us as many likes as you can give us on Facebook. The more we get, the more other people are going to learn about it. That's how these things spread and get the word out. It'd be very helpful.
See if you can get links to these pages up on your university's website, on your seminary's website. There's links. See if this link can get plugged in there. Go to your school's library and ask whether this can be listed on the library site. The librarians are phenomenal. Library science is a terrific profession, and those folks really know what they're doing. Make this link available to them so that they can point people in the right direction.
That would be great. Oh, boy. Hope to get as much as we can. Mary Ann, you give me an idea for another part of the site I'm going to think about creating. You mentioned friends, who would be interested in that cultural expression and so forth. Well, I've been toying with the idea of creating something called Friends of Life, Friends of LIFE, initials of our organization, and invite people to join us, to become collaborators with us. Our website is about spreading knowledge, about spreading faith, and encouraging people to take a serious look at issues that otherwise can be dealt with superficially and inadequately. And I like that. It sounds good, doesn't it, Friends of Life?
It does. Well, count me in. Stick me down there as Friends of Life, and I will. I'm eager to spread this message because I think this is a resource that will be useful for many of the folks that I deal with. So I'm very pleased to be a part of it. I've got to say, this hour has gone really fast. We're about at the end of our time. And Father Deacon Tom, I'm hoping that this will be just a part 1 and that you'll be willing to come back and perhaps be a frequent flyer on this program. And a few months from now, let us know what you've done in the meantime and where this is all going. But I am thrilled with
Delighted. I would love to. Thank you so much. Yeah.
You're welcome. I'm delighted with what you have offered here for the listeners of WCAT Radio, Inter Vitam et Mortem, Between Life and Death, interviews and discussion with a Catholic bioethicist. As we are about out of time right now, I'm going to ask you to slip into your role as a deacon and perhaps bless the listeners and offer prayer.
Well, thank you. Your prayer at the beginning was quite moving, but I'd like to wrap up with a prayer because I do follow John Paul so closely. He was so Marian in his devotions, and I have a tender place for Mary. My mom taught me. So I'd like to end up with what is called the Seventh Resurrectional Troparia from the Byzantine collection of, hymns we use in our Vespers and Matins prayers. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, one God, we praise you, O Virgin Theotokos, mediatrix of our salvation. For the Lord our God, who suffered on the cross in the flesh that was taken from you, redeems us from corruption. For he is the lover of mankind. Amen. And to all those listening, and to Marianne and to your associates at the Donum Vitae Institute, may God bless you, and may you always advance the cause of life as you have done so nobly and well for so long.
Thank you. Thank you. God bless.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.